Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Kraus, and I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is a process called iterative peer review that I use specifically with an assignment on resumes. I use the assignment in a course called Professional IT Communication. It's a course that we require all of our graduating majors to take. It's a writing emphasis course, so we do a lot of writing in course. But in particular, and as it pertains to iterative peer review, we do a variety of things in that class. We spend a lot of time talking about professional development, so resumes, cover letters, interviews, and those sorts of things. And then just briefly as an overview, we also spend time talking about project management, general professional communication skills, and then in the context of all of those activities, we're both preparing students for their capstone course, which is also required of all of our majors, and we're preparing students for their professional lives post graduation. So, in terms of iterative peer review, I'm going to talk about the process in the context of resumes because I think there are some very specific aspects of resume creation that lend itself particularly well to iterative peer review and some of the unique features of it as opposed to more traditional approaches to peer review. When I talk to students about resumes, there are a couple of challenges and preconceptions that I have to help them to overcome. At its heart, most of our students think that because they can just grab templates from Word or from the internet somewhere, is that they're very standard, they're very boilerplate, they're therefore very easy to do, and so they don't spend a lot of time working on them. Quite frankly, they see them as easy and just kind of following a boilerplate kind of approach. And my experience as instructor when I talk to employers is that that doesn't serve our students very well. So figuring out how to overcome some of those issues is one of the challenges that really led me to thinking about iterative peer review as part of the process. So, in terms of setting things up, I have a number of expectations for students. I want them to think not just about their resume as a document that's completed in isolation, but I really want them to think about their first employment opportunities, to evaluate them, and to then place their resumes, their cover letters, their approaches to interviewing in the context of those opportunities so that there's a better match and alignment between those. Iterative peer review is going to help us to do that as well, and you'll see that when I start walking through what that process is going to look like. There are also some practical expectations when it comes to resumes. I think it's almost cliche, and we've all read that employers will throw out resumes that have more than one or two typos that have errors or other issues with them, and so we're trying to help students deal with those kinds of issues as well. But then lastly, I think one of the biggest challenges we're trying to help students overcome, and this is an experience that I have not just with students but with our alumni, with family and friends, with colleagues, is the sense that somehow our careers and our job searches are in some senses out of our control. And iterative peer review is designed to really kind of flip that on its head and to put students back in charge of their own destinies in as much as that's possible. And so we're really trying to encourage a more active way of reaching out and soliciting feedback on a document as important as a resume. So before we get to iterative peer review specifically, what I thought I should also do is to talk a little bit about the problems associated with traditional peer review because there are some issues there that I think iterative peer review tend to address particularly well. The The first and most significant challenge, I think, with peer review is that oftentimes we just pair students up with another student in class, and we expect that one on one exchange is going to help them address any concerns that they have with whatever document they happen to be reviewing, whether that's a resume or some other document. So there's a challenge there in that if you're not paired up with someone who's either prepared or particularly well suited for that activity, you may or may not get good feedback. Instructors, of course, have addressed that issue in a variety of ways on a variety of assignments, oftentimes by extending the activity from working with just one peer to small group activities. And I think that does help address that particular problem, but it doesn't really change the fact that what we're asking students to still do is to focus on a series of rather complex tasks, and to do that over oftentimes an extended period of time, so like an entire class period. And my experience is that whether it's in pairs or in groups, students tend to get distracted um, by any of a variety of things. They tend to rush those tasks for any of a variety of reasons, and so even that approach, doesn't tend to produce the kind of results that I think we hope for when it comes to peer review. The last areas, I think, in some respects, are arguably some of the most critical when it comes to why we might spend time on iterative peer review. Um, my experience with peer review is that they tend to be the domain of writing classrooms, and they tend to be very academically focused. They get placed in the context of the writing process, but they often occur a little bit later in the process and just before students turn in their writing for grades. So they're very academic, and they're very focused on helping students sort of maximize the grade that they're going to get on an assignment. Outside of the classroom, that doesn't work, right? Students don't have that kind of constraint placed upon them when they continue to do any kind of writing as professionals. So with iterative peer review, I'm looking for something that's more authentic, something as an approach that students can take outside of the classroom and that is still going to benefit them. And so I'm going to return to task authenticity toward the end of this presentation, once I walk through some of the logistics and steps in the process, and then we can place it back in that context. But ultimately, our goal is to really start to develop a student's own self awareness and expertise as writers and as folks providing feedback on writing, so that this is something that benefits them professionally outside of the classroom as well. So, a couple of requirements for students as they get ready for iterative peer review. In this presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on physical classroom environments, although I think you'll find that it's, with a few tweaks, relatively easy to adapt this to an online environment as well. So students do need to have a draft of their resume. You do need to decide in advance if they're going to be sharing those in a computer lab on the screen through Word or Google Docs, or if they'll be using physical paper. Just a quick note here, I've done this both ways. My experience is that physical paper actually seems to work better. Students seem, by the very act of putting pen or pencil to paper, to slow down and to be a little bit more thoughtful and a little bit more thorough about the feedback that they're providing. There's something that's just different about interacting with a keyboard and a computer screen. There are cognitive reasons for that I won't get into here, but I would recommend sort of physical paper for this particular activity, although that's certainly up to you. Because it's important then that resumes be for specific positions, students should also bring at least one, and preferably, I guess, one position that they're applying for, and that needs to be available for iterative peer review as well. And then you need to be clear what kind of mechanism students are going to use for providing feedback to each other. So it's not just a matter of where is the resume, but where are students providing feedback as well. So the resume may be physically on a computer screen, but that feedback might be offered on paper, just as an example for how you might vary iterative peer review. But make sure that you've thought through all of those things and that you can set that up with students as they're getting ready for iterative peer review. Once students have made their resumes available, then you're going to ask students to move to another resume. If you're in a traditional classroom with rows, you're just going to ask them to move one seat to the right and then consistently one seat to the right. You might also let them know that The way that iterative peer review is going to work is that once they're in front of a new resume, you're going to give them one task with one prompt. You're going to ask them to respond to it, provide written feedback, and sign their name to it. You're going to also let them know ahead of time, certainly no more than 5 minutes a task, but most likely, as you're keeping an eye on the classroom, it's more likely going to be somewhere in the 3 to 5 minute range, but you'll be watching and monitoring that for them. Just one more note on logistics. This is intended to just illustrate a generic classroom with a series of desks and a series of rows, and to point out to you and your students that moving quote unquote one desk to the right means that you'll also want to explain what happens when they get to an end of a row. And so just moving arbitrarily up in the classroom in this example, or if they're at the end of the classroom, that they're moving to the beginning of the classroom. How you do this doesn't really matter as long as you talk to students and they understand how to move. Um, Typically, I've actually let this kind of play itself out in the classroom because it's something that students can usually figure out on their own. And the reason I point that out is because remember that one of the things we want to accomplish with iterative peer review is helping students in the process, invest in the process of how they're soliciting, eliciting, and providing feedback to each other. And so allowing them to invest some of their own suggestions in classroom activities is just one other small way of doing that. So, in terms of prompts, just to give you a sense, and the paper outlines a series of suggested prompts. I want to suggest just a couple for how this might work. Generally speaking, what I ask students to do anytime they're in front of a new resume is to spend a couple of minutes familiarizing themselves with the resume, then familiarizing themselves with the position for which that person is applying, and then responding to the prompt that they're given. So typically the first prompt that I'll suggest is that in reviewing the position description that they identify key languages. These are programmers, so that should be something common with most of the positions that students are applying for. So they're looking for Java, C Sharp, PHP, HTML, CSS, those sorts of things. So they identify those in the position description, then they go to the resume, they identify that the same languages for the most part are there, they circle them, and then they identify any that might be missing. For a first task, that's it. So it's a couple of minutes and then they move on to the next resume. As a second task, I then ask students to remember or reflect on the fact that oftentimes someone in HR is the first person to read their resume, and if we're talking about languages, that HR person is going to be literal. And if the position requires Java, for example, they're going to check to see that Java is a skill set that's listed on the resume. If they find it, that might be an early way of filtering resumes into a smaller set for interviews, or for setting a resume aside and not considering it. Normally, as readers of the English language or most Western languages, when we're skimming for keywords, we're looking for direct matches. And as skimmers, we're also oftentimes tending to skim down the left hand side of documents where that kind of information tends to reside. So, second task then is for the student to identify the position of those languages or keywords on the resume. So if they're not visually on the left half vertically of the resume, I ask students to do two things: to draw an arrow from where the keyword is to where the student thinks that it should instead be. And if it's just a matter of moving it, great. But if it's a matter of then having to rewrite a specific skill so that the language is on the left side of the page and not the right side of the page, that they recommend language for doing that for the author of that resume. Those are very reasonable first two tasks. They each take between 3 and 5 minutes a piece, and then you can move on with tasks from there. The last thing I would say about tasks then is that the nice thing about this iterative approach is that you're getting students up and moving in between tasks. That's important. It clears their minds and prepares them for the second task, and it breaks them up. And it breaks them up cognitively so that they're just doing one thing at a time, and you're directing each of those things so that they move from task to task. My experience is that you can keep students focused for somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes with that kind of approach, which is a much more extended period of time than you'll get from traditional peer review, where it's anecdotal, but you might get 5 or 10 minutes. It's up to you then as instructor to kind of gauge the energy level and the amount of focus in the classroom. And you might have more tasks prepared than students are able to accomplish, and that's just fine. When you do see their attention wavering, you'll want to then direct students back to their own desk and to their own resume. I want to leave with just one other logistical thought and then some final thoughts on iterative peer review. Based on my experience, I've seen a couple of things come up in the classroom, and I want to bring these up not to suggest that they will come up for you, but as a reminder of these are the reasons why you want to be mindful of what's going on in the classroom when the students are involved in peer review. If it's an authentic exercise, issues are going to come up, and you are going to have to address them. The first and the one that's most likely to recur is how do you deal with students who aren't prepared for iterative peer review? In traditional peer review, this is a slightly different issue, right? Especially if students are working in groups. It's easy for an unprepared student to sort of quote unquote hide in a group. It's harder for them to do that with iterative peer review because they're moving from resume to resume and they're providing feedback. What I would personally tell students is that if they don't have a resume with them, that you expect them to still participate and you expect them to still provide feedback to their peers. What I tell students then is that if they arrive at a desk or a workstation where there is not a resume or there's one that's really not complete, is that they get a bit of a break. They should still try and provide the student with feedback, but they should do the best that they can. It is also reasonable, I think, depending on classroom and how you handle logistics. I know some instructors tell students that they have to arrive prepared for class, and that if they're not, the expectation is that they either don't come to class or that they are asked to leave. That's at your discretion, and like I said, the vibe in my class tends to just be a little bit different, in that I still expect ways for those students to participate. The other issue that I had come up really is just an illustration of, the observation that, stuff happens that you just can't be prepared for. Um, the last time that I taught iterative peer review, I had a student in class who came to class who had a resume, who got as far as pulling it up on his computer screen, but then when students were expected to move, he refused to leave his workstation. It was a learning style and kind of a personality issue that I didn't anticipate. Maybe I should have, but that I couldn't work around. But what I observed happening was that when he refused to move, whenever a student would approach his workstation and wait for him to move, when he didn't, students were really good at observing this as well. They just kind of moved around him, so they left him alone. They let him sit. And that seemed to work to everyone's satisfaction. Now, the downside is that student got no feedback on his resume, which was unfortunate. Um, but the way students chose to handle it was, I think, in some respects, the best way of handling it, in that it was um, non-confrontational. I suspect that if the student had been confronted, that wouldn't have worked very well for anyone. So I think it was a very reasonable solution, and something again best left to students, and very authentic in that respect in terms of they took responsibility for the classroom and how they wanted to handle the situation. And although I may have handled it differently, I think that their solution worked just fine. So just a couple of final thoughts on iterative peer review that I think are worth pointing out. Um, One, I think it shifts the focus on feedback a little bit so that that feedback was focused specifically on how a student's resume was going to be used in the job search process. And I think in that sense, probably meant that it was better and more substantial feedback than they might have gotten through traditional peer review means. The second thing that I would point out doesn't necessarily have as much to do with the iterative nature of peer review in this context, but the contextual nature of it in the sense that we talked about students borrowing language from other places, relying on templates. But that this approach, because students were reacting to specific position descriptions, meant that they were really tailoring their document to that opportunity, and meant that the document really ended up being uniquely theirs at that point. It's difficult with resumes to plagiarize because you're capturing your own experiences, but I think it is easy to rely overly much on templates and language from other places. And I don't think it's quite fair to call that plagiarism exactly, but I do think that there's something about the way that students are co-constructing their resumes through the feedback that's being offered in iterative peer review that really tends to minimize those outside resources and really focus on um, the unique and specific aspects of a student's resume as it applies to their career searches. We hit on anonymity a little bit, but this really connects well to the notion of authentic learning in the sense that we want students to invest in the process. We want them to be talking to each other about writing. We recognize that writing oftentimes is a very personal kind of thing, in that it's hard to provide each other with feedback for fear of hurting each other's feelings for being overly critical of each other's writing, and recognizing that writing is difficult, that we do invest ourselves in it, and that there's some personal distancing that just seems to happen differently with iterative peer review, provided that we remind students that they need to be accountable for the feedback that they're providing. It needs to be dialogic. They need to be talking to each other, and they need to be providing each other with that constructive feedback, because, quite frankly, there's a lot at stake when it comes to resumes, cover letters, and job searches. It's not just that first job, but it's that progression into career. But it's the hope that with iterative peer review, that we get students the kind of feedback practically that they're looking for and that they absolutely need to have when it comes to their resumes and their searches, but that we're also giving them something authentic in their tool set when it comes to communication that they're going to be able to use outside of the classroom. So, in a nutshell, that's iterative peer review. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to my thoughts on the process. I hope that we can find some ways to also talk about your questions, your concerns, and as you conduct your own iterative peer reviews, your feedback and thoughts on how to make this an even better process. So, look forward to the rest of the conference and to hearing. Your own presentations for the next couple of days, even if we have to participate virtually. Thank you again from Stevens Point, and have a good conference.